Kanye West, while being on a podcast with Lex Fridman, stated that only engineering should be taught in schools. Now, the rationale behind this opinion was that engineering has two properties that distinguish and elevate it over other disciplines. First, engineering is based on objective truth and not someone's subjective opinions, and thus it cannot be hijacked and used for pushing a political agenda. Secondly, unlike history and other humanitarian disciplines, engineering is of practical importance and yields an actual output in the real world. This statement seems bizarre and outlandish at first glance, and I would argue at every other glance. The actual tragedy of this statement is that it doesn't come from someone's wild imagination, but rather from a far more complex and refined sociocultural processes. As a matter of fact, when Kanye expresses this viewpoint, it becomes more dangerous, as listeners might assume that only people who are out of their mind would say something like this. Well, as we're going to witness in this video, this opinion is held by way smarter and influential institutions than Kanye himself, which makes it 100 times more concerning. Oswald Spengler, a key 20th century philosopher who influenced Heidegger and later postmodern philosophy, stated in his major work, The Decline of the West, "It were far better to become a colonist or an engineer, to do something, no matter what, that is true and real, than to chew over once more the old dried up themes under cover of an alleged new wave philosophic thought. Far better to construct an aero engine than a new theory of apperception that is not wanted." Elsewhere he writes, "And I can only hope that men of the new generation may be moved by this book to devote themselves to techniques instead of lyrics, the sea instead of the paintbrush, and politics instead of epistemology. Better they could not do." What's noteworthy about this is that unlike Kanye or certain engineers who have also shown contempt for humanities, Oswald Spengler is neither an engineer nor someone who lacks erudition and intellect. In fact, we're talking about one of the most erudite minds who has ever lived, someone who has the highest respect for humanities and methods used in humanitarian disciplines. He is the very philosopher who defends intuition, organic understanding, empathy, and tools of humanitarian research from the scientific methods, which mainly deal with the dead objects. Spengler possesses exceptional knowledge and appreciation of history, music, art, philosophy, poetry, and fiction. His comprehension of history is not just informative, rather he lays out how historical events and philosophical schools functioned in different epochs and civilizations with a deep appreciation, respect, and poetic flair. As a result, the video's central question is why? To be more precise, why would someone believe that only engineering, or technical fields if you will, as opposed to humanities, are legitimate and worthy? Now, according to Spengler, the reason is that the Western culture has entered its winter phase, in which culture morphs into civilization and thus experiences a death. In Spenglerian metaphysics, death is the process through which a living culture exhausts its creativity and loses touch with its ethos, spirit, and prime symbol. Civilization marks the stage in a cultural's life cycle, where its entrails and inward spirit that animated and produced highest metaphysical and artistic achievements exhausts and ossifies, thus turning into a stuffed huge behemoth which becomes outward-oriented. Now, culture differs from civilization in that the former is concerned with arts, religion, and spirituality, whilst the latter is concerned with economics, politics, and money. Thus, civilization marks the point at which quality is replaced by quantity, and the inward richness and depth of cultural achievements is superseded by the sheer size, superficial appearance, and spectacularity of civilizational creations. To Spengler, civilization being the inevitable destiny of the culture can only make something impressive by increasing its dimensions, as the process of inward development and the enrichment of the soul has reached its terminal endpoint. Thus, living and metaphysically endowed Gothic cathedrals are being replaced by upward-oriented skyscrapers with their enormous size but cold and dead entrails. Both are manifestations of the same prime symbol, striving towards the infinite space, which characterizes and defines the essence of Western culture. Hypertrophied representations of electronic media avatars and celebrities, where Marilyn Monroe, for example, has to be physically enlarged so that it can somehow match the dwarfing demeanor of skyscrapers, now supplants the saints, philosophers, and great individuals of the culture period. Thus, the hugeness, hyper-enlarged dimensions, and quantitative surplus become the primary way for someone or something to be impressive. This, for Spengler, affects every aspect of civilizational existence. Even romantic relationships became quantitative. For example, nowadays, success in private life for a man of a high status is never exemplified by marrying a woman who is renowned for being the most desirable and popular because of her uniqueness, let's say. Rather, having lots of women is the key here, as quantity now supplants quality in every aspect of being. Spengler maintains that in the period of civilizational existence, our poetic awe and respect should be directed towards achievements of physical sciences, as unlike humanities that are exhausted, technical fields are authentic and congruent with the civilizational mode of reasoning. Nobody needs fiction, poetry, art, and humanities, simply because the cultural soil that once harbored such vibrant and organic undertakings has eroded. Modern, sterile, and creatively impotent civilization can only bring forth pure magnitude and extension. Thus, the energy of a culture man is directed inwards, and that of the civilizational man outwards. The man of civilization who lives in a megalopolis is unspiritual, cynical, irreligious, unphilosophical, merciless, incessantly pursuing practical accomplishments, and devoid of traditional virtues left over from the bygone age. Spengler regards cultures as organisms with a lifespan and a destiny. All of them go through 4 seasonal cycles: spring, summer, fall, and winter. Now, in the springtime, culture is born with its defining prime symbol and foundational principles. Its spirit is manifested by architecture and paintings. The hero myth is of utmost importance, as it embodies yet an unarticulated cultural values and strivings. Creativity, thus, is at its zenith. Chivalry and religious ideas, along with deeply spiritual God-feeling, are primary. Culture is rural, as megalopolis has not yet swallowed and gobbled up the provinces. Consciousness is in a heavy dream state, and thus the sharp Cartesian subject who conceives himself as an atomized and independent unit has not yet emerged. In the summertime, consciousness is ripening and urban lifestyle begins to emerge. Values, traditions, and philosophical spirit all operate under one unifying religious narrative. The metaphysical dome of the culture is up and running, protecting society from the danger of meaning crisis. The highest art forms have already been achieved, and thus the prime symbol of the culture has manifested itself in most lively phase. Rationalism and mysticism struggle and create necessary tension, which leads to creativity and establishment of high art forms. Now, in the fall phase, culture is becoming sick, and thus the reason awakes, questioning its symptoms. Thus, skepticism towards values and traditions rises. Intellectualism and rationalism supplant religiousness and mysticism. Its creative capacity is depleting. The shift from rural and urban lifestyle becomes clear. Metaphysics start to break down, exposing society to the coldness of infinite nature. And the final winter phase marks the stage of the cultural death, when it transforms into a civilization. The fact man of science and rationalism becomes central, and supplants the priest and the peasant. Religions and traditions are already dead, as humans become materialistic and valueless. The center of action is now megalopolis, as provinces become unnecessary. Everything is ultimately directed towards monetization and money-making, as the latter is a defining principle of the civilization. According to Spengler, West was undergoing this transition from culture to civilization from 19th to 20th century. Now, Spengler's point of view here is not limited to the West, as every other, like the Western, reaches its terminus and turns into a dead civilization. He sees the late Roman Empire as being directly analogous to Western civilization. Like modern West, late Roman Empire was repetitive and outward-oriented. Its people were also unspiritual, unphilosophical, and devoid of art. As Spengler says, they stood between the Hellenic culture and nothingness. As a result, their imagination was limited to merely practical objects. Spengler, for example, sees emerging 6 to 10-story lodging houses that commonly collapsed as an evidence of a shift from quality to quantity. Insula, the Roman Empire's swarming anthills, were analogous to Western skyscrapers, as size and sheer magnitude becomes primary importance in the civilizational phase. Unlike the Greek Stoicism of Chrysippus, for instance, the Roman Stoicism of Cato and Seneca presupposes a private income, as being financially successful becomes the only real and authentic fulfillment for what Spengler calls the fact man of the dead megalopolis. The folk is now replaced by the mass, and the cities full of life and artistic flair are replaced by dead and sprawling megalopolis. Syracuse, Athens, and Alexandria by Rome, whereas Madrid, Paris, and London by Berlin and New York. The old cities become provinces, as the sole genius of the countryman, noble, and priest should give way to a contemptuous factman of the megalopolis. The world city means cosmopolitanism in place of home, called matter of fact in place of reverence for tradition and age, scientific irreligion as a fossil representative of the older religion of the heart society in place of the state, natural instead of hard-earned rights. Thus, the Romans' divorce of money as an inorganic and abstract magnitude from the fruitful earth was the very advantage that they had over the Greeks, and henceforth high ideal of life becomes largely a question of money. Further, the bread and circus becomes the primary entertainment for the masses. Roman gladiators, for example, and modern UFC can be reasonably paralleled here. Sheer spectacularity and brutality becomes the only way to stimulate the people of the megalopolis. Other key characteristic of the civilization is that everything becomes self-referential. Fame for the sake of fame, art for the sake of art, exercise for the sake of exercise, money for the sake of money, as the grand purposes no longer exist. Art itself becomes a sport, hence the phrase art for the art's sake, to be played before a highly intelligent audience of connoisseurs and buyers, as being a collector now is the only authentic disposition towards art. Thus, marking the difference between culture and civilization and similarities between Rome and modern West, we get a picture where technological thinking, engineering, cold and pragmatic disposition of a typical left-brainer substitutes the poetry, art and spirituality of the culture period. The Romans were exceptionally skilled engineers. Their high-level understanding of applied physics was enough to develop aqueducts and more advanced methods of water flow. They harnessed water as energy for powering mines and mills. They also built an expensive road network, which was a great achievement at the time. Their roads were built by laying gravel and then paving with rock slabs. The Roman road system was so large, it was said that all roads led to Rome. That's why Spengler has no appreciation of Roman art. He maintains that the most authentic form of poetry in the civilizational phase is its engineering feats, the same way it could be said of the modern West. Hence, we arrive at the central question of the video, namely, what is it that engineering symbolizes in the modern world? What socio-political forces are responsible for an idea of this sort, where engineering is presented to us as the only real and legitimate discipline? Is that just someone's quirk or uninformed idea, or there is something bigger about this obsession with technical fields and contempt for humanities? Now, to get to the answer, we need to understand Spengler's distinction between two modes of apprehension, two ways of understanding, which he terms world as nature and world as history. The world as nature works in a purely pragmatic, static and numerical fashion, where a grid of equal rectangles separate you and the world you are trying to cognize. Thus, the world as nature is a mode of apprehension that is possible through inorganic, mechanical and dead world impressions, whereas world as history is characterized by an organic and intuitive understanding of that which is dynamic rather than static and frozen. The world as history deals with living objects, whereas the world as nature with cold and dead objects. This is a distinction between images and laws, picture symbols and system formulas, power of seeing and calculating, the instantly actual from the constantly possible, the intents and purposes of imagination ordering according to plan, and intents and purposes of experience dissecting according to the scheme. And lastly, the distinction between the domain of chronological, i.e. time, and domain of pure extension and space, i.e. mathematical. Hence, the world as history being necessary in humanitarian fields represents logic of time, whereas the world as nature, the cold and abstract, is logic of space. Nature is the numerable, while history, on the other hand, is the aggregate of that which has no relation to mathematics. Hence, the mathematical certainty of the laws of nature, the astounding tightness of Galileo's saying that nature is written in mathematical language. Spengler's conception of history and nature is exactly paralleled by the way psychiatrist Liane McGilchrist portrays the differences between left and right hemispheres. The right hemisphere sees the bigger picture, understands metaphors and implied thought, and deals with living and dynamic objects, whereas the left hemisphere can never comprehend the whole and is always narrowly focused on parts, as if it is always trapped in Zeno's paradox, where in infinitely divisible parts you can never get to the whole. It sees the world as being composed of individual and infinitely divisible separate and discrete building blocks that can be quantified and expressed in formulas. And finally, this is the difference between the apprehension of the world as a thing become on the one hand and world as becoming on the other. McGilchrist characterizes the left hemisphere as verbal and analytic, requiring abstract, decontextualized, disembodied thinking, dealing with and adopting a sequential, linear approach to truth, building the edifice of knowledge from the parts brick by brick like an engineer. It is a hemisphere that is primarily concerned with division and is consequently of an instrumental nature. It sees processes as static and still. It is a hemisphere of either or. A hemisphere of extreme clarity and sharp edges, which is of absolute importance in technical fields. Thus, McGilchrist and Spengler are at one in their analysis of culture becoming a civilization, which Lyon sees as a domination of the left hemisphere over its master right hemisphere. Now, this distinction is made clear by this diagram. As far as the left hemisphere is concerned, higher values should serve the lower ones, whereas for the right hemisphere, the opposite is true. Thus, left hemisphere downgrades whatever has no instrumental purpose in sight. Now, this shift affects humanities as well, as humanitarian disciplines became insecure in the contemptuous gaze of natural sciences, and thus they attempt to present their work as having a scientific worth. The reason being that the modes of apprehension of the left hemisphere became culturally dominant and introduced a standard to which the humanitarian disciplines have to conform. As Arnold Toynbee points out, historians started to call their seminars laboratories, as if they are dealing with dead objects like natural sciences. Arnold Toynbee, a prominent British historian who coined the term Industrial Revolution, understands this process as the industrialization of the historical field. And you have probably heard Kanye say that history is basically worthless and that it should not be taught in schools, because we can't tell if historical narratives are accurate or not. Toynbee sees industrialization as a conceptual shift in which practical output, division of labor, hyper-specialization of disciplines in the style of Fordism, and the turning of raw materials into usable energy took precedence as intellectual values and subjected the field of history, a discipline which primarily deals with human interactions and living objects, to its standards. Toynbee notes that as the industrial system grew its roots deep into the social fabric, sciences and academic disciplines became industrialized too. Namely, the historical and scientific works done by single authors like Darwin's Origin of the Species, poems of Mary Shelley, Mommsen's History of the Roman Republic, and others were recast and exiled in attics so that they could continue their existence in dust and nothing else. On the flip side, those general works of literature and science were substituted by dozens of specialized periodicals in green bindings, each containing many monographs by different hands, where those monographs had no relation with each other. The only thing that linked them was that they had to do something with that specific branch of science. Toynbee states that it resulted from the division of labor and the principle of maximal output, where articles should have been manufactured from raw materials mechanically. However, here we arrive at the crucial difference between history and engineering, specifically the two branches that Kanye mentioned. This process of industrialization has no negative impact on physical sciences, as both found themselves to be in harmony. Reason being that both the industrial system and physical sciences have non-human aspects in them, as they both deal with static and inanimate objects. However, its encroachment on history was detrimental and catastrophic, because history, unlike physics and engineering, is concerned with living beings, humans and human affairs. Toynbee contends that there is no assurance that the modern Western industrial system is the best regime under which to live and to labor. Thus, the industrial aim to turn raw materials into light, heat, and locomotion has infected humanities. Now, the historical field is another form of engineering, where a historian in his supposed laboratory tries to direct his energy in the assemblage of raw material, historical inscriptions, documents, and the like, in corpuses and periodicals, so that those materials can be worked up into manufactured and semi-manufactured articles. And what do you think this process leads to? Toynbee sees it as an attempt to take rank with our stupendous tunnels and the bridges and dams and high-rise buildings and giant jet planes and spacecraft, so that the editors of those periodicals where factual knowledge is assembled can be remembered among the famous Western engineers. Thus, in modern Western historical research, as in modern Western industry, the quantity and the location of raw materials threaten to govern the activities and the lives of human beings. Toynbee, as a historian who seeks to comprehend history as a whole as being composed of societies animated by nexus of human interactions, as opposed to conceptualizing history as lifeless shards of distinct and dead entities, rejects the use of the methods of physical sciences in the humanitarian domain of thought. In the world of action, we know that it is disastrous to treat animals or human beings as if they were stocks and stones. And why should we treat the field of history in the same manner? Why should we suppose that the scientific method of thought, a method which has been devised for thinking about inanimate nature, should be applicable to historical thought, which is a study of living creatures and indeed of human beings? Hence, for the closing of the video, I want to borrow two concepts from Toynbee's work: pathetic fallacy and apathetic fallacy. The first denotes an act whereby someone with an extreme humanitarian brain, or perhaps mystical inclinations such as Rudolf Steiner, let's say, or Deepak Chopra, will try to encroach on physical sciences and understand dead static objects with incommensurable methods, such as anthropomorphization and attachment of liveliness to the inanimate objects, so that they can become comprehensible to them. Take the example of Deepak Chopra, let's say, who thinks that atoms have consciousness. This is a pathetic fallacy par excellence, which is and must be disdained because the brain of Deepak Chopra is not designed to understand the world of physics and math. However, we get to the double standard here, because we now fall victims to the inverse, the apathetic fallacy of treating living creatures as if they are inanimate. As of now, if humanities won't be able to keep up with the scientific standard, then it will be considered worthless and sterile. Kanye's statement that only engineering should be taught in schools is not just some exotic statement out of nothingness. As a matter of fact, this demand, or insistence if you will, at least figuratively is already satisfied, as humanitarian disciplines are taught with the methods and world feeling of engineering. This is a long-running process that began with the Industrial Revolution and culminated in a complete destruction of humanities, where they either serve someone's political agenda or treat its object of study as a dead thing. Now, Spengler understands this as a shift from culture to dead civilization, which he accepts and endorses, as he argues that it is not just a matter of accident, but rather a manifestation of a cultural destiny. Lion Muggelchrist, on the other hand, who is a modern-day scientist, understands this as a domination of the left hemisphere over the right hemisphere. Hence, the death of arts and humanities and triumph of technical fields. But the question is, should we, however, succumb to this process and adopt a Spenglerian viewpoint, renouncing philosophy, fiction, and the arts in favor of economics, engineering, and physics? Well, what for? What does engineering serve, and what value does it have in and of itself? Why is the pursuit of engineering worthy if we consider ourselves to be nothing more than pieces of physical nature? If the only conceptual and contextual framework through which we understand ourselves is of physical nature, like Neil deGrasse Tyson says, for example, that like the universe we're also predominantly made out of hydrogen, carbon, and nitrogen, then where do grand purpose and the sense of value come from? Doesn't the act of expansion and extension through the feats of engineering lose its meaning if we don't view ourselves as a dynamic unit in a historical moment where we should be aiming for something? After all, engineering and the left hemisphere approach are just tools, aren't they? A method for controlling nature and creating wonderful constructions, buildings, and machines. But if history and historical spirit has no significance and is powerless to pass on meaning to modern society, then what is it that those tools serve? What are those instruments for? And also, where do you think values of simplicity, expansion, technological advancement, progress, empirical evidence, and practical applicability come from? Does it come from engineering and rational impulse, or from something which is perhaps more lively and irrational? However, as it turns out, engineering for the sake of engineering is the additional formula to the other self-referential formulas mentioned above. And lastly, I want to answer Spengler, who thinks that the sphere of architecture, arts, and music have reached their terminal endpoint. As he says himself, we cannot help it. if we are born as a man of the early winter of full civilization, instead of on the golden summit of a ripe culture in a Phidias or Mozart's time. Everything depends on our seeing our own position, our destiny clearly, on our realizing that though we may lie to ourselves about it, we cannot evade it. He who doesn't acknowledge this in his heart ceases to be counted among the men of his generation, and remains either a simpleton, a charlatan, or a pedant. Well, we absolutely can help it. Western civilization has a considerably superior immune system than the prior societies mentioned by Spengler. Technology is a tool, and a tool can always be subjugated to the will and the moral intentions of its user. There are lots of people who are exceptionally talented in art, history, fiction, and philosophy. People who have instinctive aptitude for humanities and conceptualization of the world as history, rather than as a dead and static nature. Unfortunately, nowadays those who are doing humanities turned frigid and became victims of the world as nature, where they have to conceive themselves as just a part of physical universe, rather than a part of a grand historical process, as the logic of space trumps the logic of time. Thus, after the encroachment of the so-called apathetic fallacy, humanities took a hard blow. However, the very reactionary ethos of the Faustian culture, which is characterized by the will to resist and transform, can very much re-emerge and reassert itself. I do not believe that humanities and academy can die and ossify that easily. The very act of believing and living under the illusion that philosophy and history and humanities do not matter reminds me of the famous saying, "The devil convinced people that he doesn't exist." Well, humanities do exist, and it does have a huge influence on how we think and conduct ourselves in everyday life. It's just the mode of its thinking has been infected and needs to be vaccinated. As always, I'd like to express my heartfelt gratitude to my Patreons who are supporting me and making sure that the channel goes on. If you want to support me, you can become a Patreon too. You can find the links in the description. Also, I would like you to express your opinion about the present condition of humanities and tell me if you think if there is a way out from this condition.